Yes, I guess today's session is on the idea of collectives and community, and we started to wonder about the differences. I actually took your notes, is that okay? These are Kristen's words, not mine, in the spirit of collectivism. The idea of collectives and how that relates or differs from the idea of community, and what are the different imperatives, what's at stake when we gather as a collective. And inherent within the idea of community is an underlying word of common. But what does that mean when people come together and forge a communal or collective gathering? What does that do? What's the need or the desire for gathering collectively? And we wanted to talk about the duration of that.
Oh, yeah. So it kind of goes with this thinking. So we can unpick it in the roundtable, but the relationship and difference between collectivity and community, and the implication of duration, possibly, for each. So it's just a preliminary thought, but thinking around the idea that some collectives may form in relation to a particular impetus or a particular political moment, and they need to be together to work together. They don't necessarily need to have tons in common or practices or thoughts in common, but they need to kind of organize and work even across and through difference to mobilize for a particular moment. And just kind of comparing that with the idea of community as possibly something that may or may not be a longer durational practice, or that might relate to I don't know, where you live or how you live or who you live with, and that kind of thing tends to get associated with that. But it was something I was just hoping we could pick up a little bit. It may relate a little bit to, I know in the seminar, another one of the texts that you have is the text by Angela Davis, that's thinking about thinking across different struggles and the need to kind of think across difference and different struggles. So she relates Ferguson to Palestine, and she kind of has this interesting way of kind of thinking, if you're going to think about Ferguson, you cannot not think about Palestine, even though they may seem like totally different situations. But the notion of intersectionality that's kind of been an undercurrent for this as well, of thinking across differences, race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, etc., in any kind of cause or mobilization.
So we're just going to introduce our speakers, who will then come up and give, in the roundtable format, we have 10-minute presentations from each of our speakers, and then we'll move into the roundtable discussion, and then we'll open it up to all of you with questions. Clarissa Kay Jacob completed her thesis last year on the American feminist film magazine Women in Film 1972 to 75. The research was based on extensive interviews with the magazine's founders, as well as the many contributors who wrote for it, such as Bill Nichols, Barbara Hammer, and Constance Penley. She currently teaches film and TV at UCA and Royal Holloway.
Okay, Rosy Martin started working with the late Jo Spence in 1983 to evolve and develop a new photographic practice-phototherapy based upon re-enactment. So practice of phototherapy based upon re-enactment. Through embodiment, she explores the psychic and social construction of identities within the drama of the everyday. Her work makes explicit the multiplicity of identities that an individual inhabits, using the self as a text to be deconstructed, reviewed, challenged, and considered. Rosy very much belongs to the collective, collaborative activism generation, whether as an activist squatter setting up a housing co-op, which it did not get the property, but did shift council policies at the time. I've lost my place. Okay, Feminisms, Brixton Art Gallery, a member of the women's and lesbian and gay groups, Women's Design Service, a women's collective. She was also a member of a number of informal photography groups. It was a way of life in those days for so many, is what you had said. Rosy continues to work collaboratively, including with Kay Goodridge on Outrageous Agers, and with others who want to explore issues using phototherapy-derived techniques. She's also a founding member of Family Ties Network.
And Ash Reid's performance-based practice reflects her experiences in support work and organising. Recent projects have looked at cognitive behaviour therapy techniques and role-playing game structures, performed through ongoing communication with others, publicly and in private. In recent years, Ash has been an invited speaker and reading group host for Lux Scotland in Glasgow and Hospital Field Arbroath, performed at Wising Arts Centre Music Festival in collaboration with musician Lena Rosita, worked with the group Pond Scum for events at IMT Gallery and the Vestry Museum in London, and performed at Tectonics Festival in Glasgow, curated by composer Ilan Volkov, and presented by the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. Ash was a voluntary member of the Cine Nova working group, a feminist film distributor, which we're going to hear more about, and is currently undertaking research into the collection as an MPhil PhD candidate at Goldsmiths.
And Marina Vishmidt, who some of you may know, who works at Goldsmiths, teaches at Goldsmiths, a London-based writer, editor, and critic occupied mainly with the questions around art, labor, and value. Marina is the author of Speculation as a Mode of Production and A for Autonomy, with Kristen Kreider. She often works with artists and contributes to journals such as Mute, After All, Text Circumstance, Ephemera, Kaleidoscope, Parquet, and Open, as well as co-edited collections and catalogues, most recently Anguish Language. She's authored chapters in the Routledge Companion to Art and Politics and The Economy Reader. She's taught individually or as part of a collective at University of the Arts, Berlin, Central St. Martin's, Goldsmiths, and the Royal Academy, Copenhagen. Her work on debt, social reproduction, and artistic entrepreneurialism can be found on libcom.org and in the Efflux Journal. And she has also lectured and given workshops on these topics in universities, art institutions, and activist spaces. Vishmidt also has a long-term involvement with the artist moving image in critical and exhibition contexts, such as feminist film distributor Cine Nova and the free cinema full unemployment cinema. Okay, excellent bios, and we look forward to our first speaker, Clarissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Clarissa Jacob. It was a bit last minute, my appearance tonight, so apologies if this is a bit rambly or thrown together. And I've adapted this from a paper I gave at a conference, which was a little bit longer, so I'm going to keep an eye on the time, but give me a wave if I go over. And yeah, if there's anything that doesn't make sense on the slides, and I don't necessarily have time to kind of go into it, maybe make a note and we can talk about it a bit more. But so basically, I'm going to be talking about a magazine called Women in Film. It was published in California from 1972 to 1975, so very short-lived. And it came before what a lot of people kind of think of as the theoretical turn in feminist film criticism. It is, as far as I can tell and know, the first sort of feminist film journal to be published. So it's very interesting. It includes loads of different perspectives. You can kind of tell from the title, Women in Film, you can't really get more general than that. And it came out of quite an interesting sort of countercultural political moment that involved feminism, but also things like Maoism. So I finished my thesis on it last year, and I was researching and writing about it for about 6 years, and that involved a lot of interviews and kind of correspondence with the people involved. So that's what this paper is mostly about, is the women involved in the magazine, and a kind of collective or attempted collective, because it wasn't necessarily a true collective, at least according to some of its members. So yes, a little bit of background there. I've given you some of that already, but so the people involved were initially based in Santa Monica, within Los Angeles, and then some of them moved to Berkeley. And yeah, what they published was mostly what's called kind of images of women criticism, and a lot of the articles are called things like the image of women in film, and tend to be these kind of surveys of cinema and the kinds of female characters you find in them, and then less interested, or kind of less, they're not so much thinking about some of the psychoanalytic or semiotic approaches that people like Laura Mulvey, who I'm sure a lot of you will know of, later pioneered. And this sort of polarity between a theoretical approach and a kind of non-theoretical approach, although that's not really an accurate term, because obviously there's a theory behind everything. That was kind of played out within the personnel of the magazine. So there were some contributors who joined a bit later on who were very interested in those psychoanalytic theories and those semiotic theories, and that caused a bit of a clash amongst the personnel. So that's one of the kind of key things I'm going to look at. So these are the two founding co-editors, Siwa Bay, who originally came from Penang in Malaysia, and Sandra Salier, Sony, as she was called at the time. And so they're part of this baby boomer generation. Siwa had come to the US originally on a sort of scholarship and spent a year as a senior at a US high school. She was crowned homecoming queen, and she managed to come back and got another scholarship to a kind of on a dance program at Mills College in Oakland, and she realized eventually, actually, what I want to do is make films. So she transferred to UCLA, which had a relatively well-established filmmaking course, one of the kind of few in the country at the time. Salier was what she calls herself an army brat, so she spent a lot of her childhood touring around the US and Europe, and lived in Japan for a while. She went to a number of different universities, kind of hopping around trying to find the right fit. She ended up eventually at San Francisco State, and she was there for the state strike, where the students protested partly because they wanted to set up a Black Studies department. And one of the key influences for her was her involvement with radical therapy, and she was very close with some people who were involved in Isalan, which was this kind of community that was set up in Big Sur, I believe, in California, where they did things like yoga, but they also did Gestalt therapy and sort of transcendental meditation and things like that. So this is my little collage of some of their influences. Now, Siwa was very interested in Marxism. A lot of the reading material that she managed to get hold of as a student when she was in California had been banned in Malaysia, so it had a kind of extra appeal. And so she was really interested in this idea of political cinema, a people's cinema, whereas Salier was much more interested in psychedelia and the sort of the sexual revolution, and a lot of the kind of art house cinema coming out of Europe. And these are, some of these are sort of titles from articles in the magazine, and I'm a big fan of this in particular. This is a little strip that ran alongside the first editorial, and they've got these tiny images of Cinema magazine, which was a kind of hip movie sort of magazine that always had these kind of babes on the cover, which they've kind of ripped in this sort of symbolic angry act. So this is a little quotation from Salier in our interview. She talks about this the countercultural moment. I'm not going to read it because I think I'll run out of time, but I can bring it up later if anyone wants to have a look at it. And obviously one of the things that brought these two women together was their interest in feminism. And a shared anger, basically. They both experienced kind of sexual harassment and assault as students, and that was one of the things that brought them together and made them found the magazine. A little bit later on, they met up with these four women who would later go on to found Camera Obscura. Janet Bergstrom, Constance Penley, Elizabeth Lyon, and Sandy Flitterman. And these women had much more traditional kind of academic backgrounds. And this is where some of the tensions around kind of the approach that the magazine was going to take towards writing about film, and also the kind of readership and the kind of audience it was going to have, started to cause some disputes. And yes, they decided they wanted to work as a collective, and they'd had this idea in their first editorial: we hope to form a collective, we hope to find other women who want to work with us and form a collective. And this did happen, but it seemed to happen in different ways for different people. I'm just going to skip over this bit. So Penley and others, they were very keen to use an approach informed by semiotics and structuralism. And for Suwa and for Sonya, although they found these approaches interesting, they found them unhelpful to less educated readers. And their kind of mission for the magazine had always been, we want to reach the woman on the street. And as they were not really keen to give up their tenure as the kind of founding co-editors and having that editorial control over the magazine. So eventually the group consulted with a mediator who, according to, I think it was Penley, was actually a nun who'd done workplace dispute mediation and stuff. This was ultimately unsuccessful. It went on, I think, for at least a year. And the woman who would then go on to found Camera Obscura kind of publicly split from the magazine and founded Camera Obscura about a year later. This kind of rocked the kind of remaining staff, and this is an image from their last issue. They actually had another issue that was kind of put together, and they ended up not publishing it. So this ended up being their last issue, and they write about kind of feeling crushed by the sort of financial constraints of running a magazine for basically no money. And I know you guys have talked before about precarious work, and that is one of the kind of, they wouldn't have called it that, but that was definitely an issue that led to the magazine folding. So I think that's 10 minutes, right? So yeah, I'm going to stop there. But yeah, thank you very much.
Well, it was very hard to find any pictures, of course, because back then, we didn't really have pictures in the way we do now. It wasn't like snap, 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 and it certainly weren't digi-ready. So how do I represent a lifestyle? That's really hard. But just to say that feminism or feminisms, of course, because we had to put an S on the end of all these things now, kind of explained the problematics of my life pretty quickly. So I was reading all those books when they first came out, because I originally studied as a scientist, chemist, and women weren't supposed to be in that space, and then I did industrial design, and there were no other women in that space. So I was having to deal full on with a lot of stated and unstated sexism anyway. But then, we'll skip a bit. Yes, okay, squatting, that took a lot of time. That really was about working with people you might not have actually chosen to be with, which is always interesting, because it's these cozy little collectives that we make are very different from this notion of cooperatives and even community, which you decided to bring up at the beginning. Much more problematic, of course. But I was one of the organisers, because it turned out, despite the fact that I'm not good at getting funding, doing the accounts, my minutes are always a bit long-winded. I'm a kind of organiser person. I kind of wanted everybody to get on. How stupid could I be? So idealism is one of the things I think we have to throw up as both why people do it and also maybe why it goes wrong. In fact, I have a few really important things that I wanted to bring up before I show you any pictures. So there's contested multiplicities of identities, which I think you already brought up, issues around gender, class, race, sexualities, abilities, disabilities. And I'm throwing age in there as well, because that's my new subject area. Fairly obviously, because I like to kind of work from where I am. And I am old. And it's an issue, it's not funny, it's really an issue. If you view the world from where I'm sitting, standing. Anyway, that's another subject, really. So we've got all those. We've got idealism. But what I think you need if you're going to keep working in these areas is, well, resilience is a new word for it. My mother would have called it coping. I sneered at my mother for coping. I learnt to respect my mother when she was on a walking frame and could barely do anything for her capacity to cope. Because she's, First World War generation, they really had to cope. Change, things are always changing. It's a bugger, they do. Excuse my language. Endings. And that's a really painful thing, which you brought up in yours, and letting go. Oh, maybe I've got 5 minutes for some quick pickies. Why did I spend so long doing that? Okay, so I worked in a women's collective, a proper women's collective, founded originally by London Borough's Grants Unit, which took over from the GLC. And we did very radical work around women and design in the built environment. And this actually still kind of is important. People still haven't dealt with this issue. And another one that I worked on particularly was play spaces for under sixes. Why I pulled out the content list was why children's play is a women's issue, taking a child's view, the importance of play, anti-sexist, anti-racist, disabled people, children as designers. So it's all about actually asking the people who are going to use this stuff and asking the people who are going to be hanging around with the kids who are going to be use this stuff what they want. And it was very environmentally focused, and it wasn't about swings and roundabouts. Still radical. Still give this book away, although a lot of the references probably aren't valid anymore and you can't find all those wonderful initiatives. But it was about change. It really was. We really wanted to change policy, and we did in many instances. And local authorities and planners and designers used to consult us. So we were a kind of information base. This was part-time work, I hasten to say. Usually my work has been part-time in the voluntary sector or hourly pay in institutions, and money is a big issue. I notice we have somebody here speaking about money, and I should say that all my art practice has been unfunded, apart from the occasional grant to make an exhibition. And that's a big issue. And maybe I was lucky that I came from the generation that I came from, who didn't think you needed inside toilets and roofs that didn't leak and shit. I mean, it's stupid. I still live like a student, really, but I love my work, so there you go. Oh, yes, this was an example from the Brixton Art Gallery. That, again, was working collectively. They had a big exhibition, and they've got a archive now at Tate. But I was involved in the lesbian and gay and the women's section of that. And I kind of had to bring this up because it's got things like a creche, wheelchair access. All these things were thought of as important. And quite a number of black practitioners were talking about their work. So this is way back in '86. And I'm throwing it up to say, we really did care about identities in a broad sense way back then. Except, it's grotty typeface, and it would have been a flyer, But why I decided it was worth having that list of events was, I think it was £1 to go as well, or in free, or 50p unwaged. I mean, just the kind of care that was taken to make sure that everyone was involved, I thought was interesting from that time. And I don't think we're doing it well enough now. I don't think there are creches now when there are women's events. Why? Women start having kids? I wonder. Anyway. Oh dear. Phototherapy. I'm not going to have time to talk about what is phototherapy. You really are going to have to check that out. There's a few links I've offered. But it's about working with another person in collaboration. It's about one person being the therapist, listener, counsellor, who pulls out the story and is there for the other person. It's about the person in front of the camera telling their story within an environment of safety and trust. And it's a totally collaborative way of working, and one person can't do it on their own. You have to have the two. And that was just an example of, a process. So it shifts from the reenactment of an original photograph to the stress and memory that Jo had of her father just after he had suffered the bereavement, death of his wife, and ending up in an affirmative image, because if it's therapy, it actually has to be about taking care. So it's a transformative process that ends with the form of taking care. The images that get seen are always the sort of shock horror ones, but I always emphasize the fact that within this process, you don't just dump people in the shit and walk out the door. You ensure there's a closure. This was interesting because I didn't use the original picture as a model, but thought about what it was like to be posing for my father. This is one of Jo's well-known images about when she refused to have a mastectomy. An image she couldn't make at the time. That's another important part of this practice. This shows you how it was exhibited originally. In other words, lots of prints, not emphasizing the one precious image, but very much about the process, the how. And this was shown recently at Tate. You may have seen it. So we're talking about the teenage Jo sort of enjoying her sexuality, overviewed by Madonna with Hoover, and the desire and discontent that entraps within a relationship. Can I carry on, or should I shut up now? No. Keep going? Okay. Gone slightly over time, but I wanted to bring up some general issues for the round table. This was early work I did with Jo, and I took an image of my mum and tried to make myself look like her, wearing her clothes, well, her jacket anyway, but very strange making oneself look like somebody else. Because, well, as you get older, you see your parents in the mirror all the time, but I hadn't really started to do that when I did this work. And then thinking about what she said to me, which was, life is hard, you won't get what you want, and also this feeling of entrapment, because it was very much about, if you look okay, you can go anywhere. My father was a tailor, so he could make you look okay, but she wanted me to speak proper. I speak like this because I went to a posh school, and I had to because I was bullied, so I had to learn to speak with this beautiful accent, which cost a lot of money and time. But actually, it was bullied for it, and it was unpleasant. And these are the hidden things, which also I made work about. So we're talking about this sort of feeling of responsibility and having to take the weight on one's shoulders, and yet still, she did like the fact that Dad made those beautiful clothes. Years later, after she died, I did this work with Kay Goodridge, in which I repositioned myself in that jacket with that photo and tried to shift to learning how to mother myself, because my mother's last years have been racked by multi-infarct dementia and arthritis, and she was quite a hard person to be around. I mean, if any of you have been in the carer role with someone with dementia, you'll understand. You kind of lose them, and it's quite heartbreaking. So this was a very important thing to do, and it actually does talk about why the work is a kind of therapy, because it was something I needed to do to retain a notion of a relationship and also internalize something good. So that was very healing. And this is the work I did with Kay, Outrageous Agers, which is good fun. And yet, the Guardian's headline was Cellulite for Sore Eyes. Okay. It's also about how do you feel when you go in the changing room, obviously, which I think is quite a general experience for women, not just for older women. Come on. Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, this was the real Cellulite for Sore Eyes, but hey. So it's sort of partly glamorous and partly... It's playing with... Martin's Law. It's taking the stereotypes and just turning them upside down and being playful, which is another really important aspect of my practice. Very important to play. This was Ugly Bits. I'm doing more on this now. I've got even more wrinkles and double chins. It's fun. But actually, we made a frieze, and they were quite beautiful, all these ugly bits joined together, all the bits that one has learnt to hate about one's body. And then this is the, drawing on theory, which I do. I mean, I'm not sort of making a big point about how theoretically embedded I am, but I am. And this was taking some quotes and replaying them by projecting them on the body so that the body kind of eats up the words and takes the power. And yes, I've just started working with a woman called Verity Wellstead and looking at aging from where I am now. And she's 20 years younger, but it's quite interesting because she's the age I was when I was originally started doing this work on aging. But looking across generations, I think, is also really, really important. And I would like to posit that to this audience, because I guess I am here as the oldie. But, I really want to reach across. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we're just going to start off with a clip, which is from a film called Seeing for Ourselves, which is also, I'm sorry about the shambles of this PowerPoint, but my laptop is dying and it's bad. Anyway, so this is a film called Seeing for Ourselves. It's a really short clip. This film was actually made at the time of Circles, which we'll talk about in a bit, but this is one of the feminist film distributors that existed before Cine Nova, so it's just a kind of like short introduction on that.
Hello, Circles. For the 28th. Hang on, I'll just check that. Done. Okay, if you could just send in a confirmation of that order. Circles is a feminist distribution network which was set up by and for women to distribute women's films and videotapes. In addition to sending these films around the country and liaising with programmers, we organise shows by women working in other related media, such as tape slide presentations and performance art. Creating a public place for the showing of women's work and the provision for discussion afterwards amongst a women-only audience is a vital part of Circle's activities. Another part of Circle's work is to research women's film history and to bring back into circulation work by early women filmmakers, for example, Germaine Dulac and Alice Guy, and to show their work alongside contemporary material.
When I wonder why I write sentences, take photographs, make films, then I wonder why so many women write sentences, take photographs, make images. Then I listen to these things that women do make. Then I think, well, there it is. There's so much to speak of, to see and to say. And women speak and see and say such necessary things. Raise disruptive questions, show uncomfortable perspectives, so I know, I see and hear an answer. The answer I do not hear is why so few women are allowed to say such necessary things in public. So do I really wonder why I made the film like reading, why anger is always present and pleasure never far away.
That's what's really good about the Circles discussions though afterwards, because there is that sort of space to have a discussion, whereas when something's on television or a cinema or theatrical performance, you can't very often have a discussion with the audience or with anybody involved in the production. And I find that a lot of the work in circles is about those problems of language and like terminology and of images and words.
I think that's why feedback is really essential, so that people come and they know what they're coming for and they can actually feel really part of what's going on.
Okay, so so we kind of wanted to start off on a historical note, and I'll sort of continue on with that for a little bit before transitioning to more contemporary viewpoint from Ash. So I've been working with Cine Nova as a member of the Cine Nova working group, and prior to that as a volunteer for the organization since sort of mid-2000s, around 2003, 4, 5. So yeah, as you saw from this clip, really to understand the current work of the organization, we need to have some insight into the organization's history. Circles is one of the two organizations which came together to constitute Cine Nova in the 90s. Circles started in the early 80s. But you just heard the voice of Liz Rhodes, during the typewriter sequence, who was one of the kind of very prominent member of the London Filmmakers Co-op, one of the founding members of Circles, and who also has her films distributed with Cine Nova, and who we've worked with on lots of different occasions. So I just want to start maybe with a quote from her text, which has always been really kind of foundational for us, the Whose History text, which is also about the kind of collective, history as a collective project, I guess, or the understanding of history as something which is made rather than absorbed or is taught. So in this text, written on the occasion of a withdrawal of a group of feminist filmmakers from quite a formalist survey of experimental film at the Hayward Gallery in the late 70s called Film as Film. And that was in a way the founding moment of Circles, the organization you've been looking at here. So she writes, "Feeling unwilling to write, an inability to manipulate ideas into a theory and facts into a convincing argument, an apprehension at intervening in the hierarchy of film history, an alienation from its underlying thesis of development. I began to reflect. I stopped writing. I read a sentence written by Gertrude Stein. Define what you do by what you see, never by what you know, because you do not know that this is so." She goes on, "The history represented here is she's referring here to that exhibition, Film as Film. The history represented here is the illustration of a philosophical ideal, the meshing of moments to prove a theoretical connection. It is as though a line could be drawn between past and present and pieces of a person's life and work pegged on it. No exceptions, no change. Theory looks nice. The similarity of item to item reassuring. Shirt to shirt, shoulder to shoulder. An inflexible chain, each part in place. The pattern is defined. Cut the line, and chronology falls in a crumpled heap. I prefer a crumpled heap, history at my feet, not stretched above my head." So, yes, Liz Rhodes and a few other, I guess, quite sort of well-known and active and sort of, by this point now, relatively historicized filmmakers such as Annabelle Nicholson, Felicity Sparrow, Jeanette Iljon, Mary Pat Leese, and others who are still less well-known, Susan Stein, Pat Murphy, Jane Clark, for example, were part of the Women's Committee of the London Filmmakers Co-op who went on to found Circles. So as you heard from the clip, one of the motivating impulses of Circles was to kind of recover a certain kind of history of film, which was a history made by women filmmakers, or the part that had been kind of lost. So something that you also see in feminist art history at the time and before, this idea of recovery of the kind of occluded figures who were constitutive for the history of a medium or the history of a form of cultural production. So like Germaine Dulac, Alice Guy, even Maya Deren, who had been a bit forgotten at that point, and thus seeking to contextualize their own work and the work of within kind of individual and collective practices that were going on in terms of film production, but also organization. So whether it's organizing cooperatively as women filmmakers or in living projects such as squatting that Rosy mentioned, and other kind of collective communal education projects and production projects. So the Cinema of Women was the other organization that came combined with Circles, formed Cine Nova, and that was more around documentary and activist film. And in the 1980s, kind of funding from the Greater London Council, commissions and sales to Channel 4. A lot of the films that we have from that period came through some of those channels. Also kind of international film festival funding, academic funding. So the Cine Nova collection includes people like starting from, for example, Alice Guy in the 1910s and 20s, to Trinh Minh Ha, Kim Longinotto. So with the kind of focus on artist film that you got from Circles, or kind of artists and sort of like more theorized, perhaps in some ways, experimental film practice coming out of the kind of structural materialist legacy of the co-op, London Filmmakers Co-op, with the Cinema of Women, which is focused more on campaigning films, although these are not kind of exclusive categories. Cine Nova ended up containing a kind of diversity of screening, both films and kind of screening genres, from kind of education to traditional cinema and film festival contexts, activist meetings, also educational contexts. So this kind of combination of the two organizations in the early 90s was really a kind of forced merger by the BFI, who was the main funder of both organizations, and they didn't want to fund two feminist film distributors, so they asked them to merge. So in the 90s, of course, you have this kind of the emergence of sort of the newer sort of neoliberal funding regimes based on business plans, the introduction of kind of corporate style economies across sort of the nonprofit sector. Things being based on fees, on kind of an idea of service provision rather than any kind of sort of more self-organized formats. So by the early 2000s, late 90s, Cine Nova in 2000 had its funding removed and has been pretty much run on a volunteer basis since then. Although we're a nonprofit organization, so we are formally constituted as a charity. We're not just a kind of self-organized collective project, although that is how we run. So we wanted to also preserve the collection as a collection. So it's as a distributor rather than a collection, so that we enter into relationships and contexts with other groups, other institutions, other projects, other people, and kind of it remains kind of alive as a project rather than passing a collection on as an archive into the care of a university or an institution. So we can talk, I think I'm running out of time, talk about all this a bit more in the roundtable, but kind of part of the last decade of Cine Nova's activity has been in a way kind of figuring out ways to be more public and more collaborative. And so in 2010, we had our exhibition of kind of activating the collection at the Showroom Gallery in West London. It was called Reproductive Labor. And that was very much about bringing the archive, the paper archive and the film and video archive into the space of where it could be interacted with and not just kind of accessed as a list on the website, which is all we had at the moment. And so that was in a way kind of a turning point for us in terms of kind of finding other ways to think about distribution as a more collaborative project. So maybe I'll turn it over to Ash now.
I'm just going to work out how to change slides.
Just go back. And then you just use the arrows.
That's not on the side. Okay, this is our logo, which we've been trying to change for a while, but haven't managed it. Anyway, so from that show, we started to think, like the working group started to think around kind of, I guess, as Marina said, how we can keep the collection active, even though we don't have the ability as volunteers to really, or like the money to take on other like newer work. So we tried to start thinking about how we could have conversations with people about the work, but then also bring their work into it. So we started a series of events called Now Showing, which this is documentation of some of the posters that one of our working group members, Charlotte, makes. So yeah, what we do is we invite a filmmaker in, a contemporary filmmaker, and ask them to choose a work from the collection that kind of resonates with their work, in the kind of hope that, like, you know, what we notice a lot is a lot of the work, its contents are still, you know, politically, socially relevant today. So it's really interesting to see how those themes resonate through work and continue, and what like ways that we can think about what can be like learned from this collection, keep it going. I just wanted to bring some of the other members in. This is us doing Now Showing DIY space. And I guess other ways that we kind of have been thinking about, kind of, I guess the problem with doing Now Showings is that it tends to kind of stay in art contexts, and a lot of the work in the collection is from community projects, from educational situations. So we were trying to think as well, how can we bring the collection back into those spaces? So we had this opportunity to do an exhibition at Lux. We also share an office with Lux, so we got the exhibition space. We started looking at this work from the collection called Time and Time Again, which was made by Women in the Law Collective. Now, this was made in 1986, this film. It's a series of 3 that they made. And this particular film looks at women in prison. We were kind of doing some research. We didn't know the filmmaker, we didn't have contact with the filmmaker at the time who'd actually specifically made it. So we were doing a lot of research trying to find her, and also find out where these films kind of came from. They were partly funded by the Greater London Council, which funded a lot of amazing projects in the mid-80s, when it was this sort of weird bubble of socialism that was happening in London. But also it was partly funded by a charity called Women in Prison. So we got in contact with them. We didn't have the film at all in their collection, so we started having conversations with them. Eventually we got more and more involved, and then ended up kind of helping out at this prison abolition conference last year in the summer called Abolitionist Futures, which was really great. So that kind of brought the collection back into that kind of circuit, away from the art world as well. We also kind of did another exhibition at Lux. We realised that our collection is not very accessible, partly through just logistics, but also in the fact that a lot of our work isn't subtitled, or it doesn't have any sort of other way of narrating itself. So we used this exhibition to start a conversation with a group in Glasgow called Collective Text. Collective Text works specifically with artists moving image to subtitle and make captioning, make it audibly accessible for a lot of different people. So that's kind of, I guess, projects that we're working on at the moment, and I guess is just trying to sort of bring into the space how we are trying to work with other communities, not just in our kind of collective selves as Cine Nova. And I just wanted to end the presentation very quickly with a flyer of another community that's working in Goldsmiths. The security guards at the moment are trying to unionise. They have unionised. Goldsmiths are not recognising IWGB as their union, but they're having a protest on the 14th of February asking to be brought in-house as workers. So I'll go to that. Yep.
Thank you, all of you, for just giving us a very compact account of what you're doing, which because obviously it's not fair to ask you to do just a 10-minute presentation. But hopefully some of the ideas that have just been talked through, we can unpack a little further. I guess there were just 3 things that came up across all of your presentations. One, and I've bracketed the problem of theory, or how the theoretical causes conflicts or can be a springboard for image making, but may also possibly act as a counter to activism, or to, maybe it's going in opposition sometimes with the motivations of collective work. Then I think broadly there might be a connection with therapy or restoration or reparative relations in looking back and thinking about now. And finally, idealism, which seemed to run through as why might we participate in looking at things that have been forgotten, looking at things that have been, just totally overlooked, and the work that you're all participating in keeping things active and alive in our minds. So those were the 3 areas that perhaps we could open up to you to touch upon, whichever aspect you want, and then we'd ask the audience. Would anyone like to start?
I mean, the kind of theory versus practice, or theory versus activism, was something that came up so much for me in the interviews that I did, and it really brought out very strong feelings from the people I interviewed, who I think had felt they had a personal stake in one side or the other, and actually the sort of the conflict between the sort of women in film people and the camera obscura people was very tender when I interviewed people, and they were really scared that I was going to misrepresent them, or kind of side with and so it's, I mean, I went sort of round and round in circles, and I tried to kind of understand why why this split happened and why they weren't kind of agreeing around these things. And I think some people felt it was a class thing, that the camera obscura group were more middle class, more kind of traditionally academic, and the way I kind of came to see it was that they were just coming from a very different approach and they were coming from a much more academic background. And I don't think that other women involved were any less kind of middle class, to be honest. But yeah, it's I cannot get my head around these divisions. And there were a few people who managed to kind of sort of encompass both sides. There's 2 people that were involved in women in film, Julia Lesage and the late Chuck Kleinhans, who founded Jump Cut, managed to kind of straddle both sides of activism and theory. But yeah, I'd be interested to know how it felt for you, Rosy, that division, if you felt it was something that came up for you in that period, that it was a kind of source of conflict.
Well, not in the photography practice that I had, because it was very much about developing the process that actually fed into theory, and not illustrating theory. Really important. And I would say actually we're doing things like performing gender before it was a much discussed issue in theoretical frames. I'm sorry, I would actually say quite often artistic practice and process predates some theory. Naughty thing to say, which I'll get told before I know. But I have discussed with others, people who are academics, who would agree with that. I made my living by teaching anyway, so I refuse to accept the divide. But I can see why in the women in cinema when it would have happened. And I think there was a polarisation, because the semiotic theory and the psychoanalytic theory and the French theorists that we all have to read. I mean, it's difficult stuff. And if you just think, oh, I don't like the way women are represented in a kind of gut way, it's quite a lot to ask everybody who's interested in those ideas to go away and read all those philosophers. But I think we're being asked to do that more now anyway. But back in the 70s, early 80s, that was a big ask. Is that any kind of an answer?
Yes, yeah, no, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've all been, both of you have been saying is, and also what I was thinking with what was sort of being suggested in the Liz Rhodes quote that I read, was almost like theory becomes a kind of site of contestation about the gendered nature of the production of knowledge. So it's like what counts as theory, what counts as history, and like what counts as our being able to, like what is usable in this, and how do we intervene in this. And so that in itself is as being a kind of this questioning of theory as a kind of activist or kind of political gesture, or like theory as a kind of praxis that needs to be torn out of its theoretical sort of molding in a way. But also I think very much kind of the divide amongst kind of women filmmakers and women kind of practitioners in film at the time really kind of, and sort of theorists of film like camera obscura, really kind of people who are theorists and practitioners at the same time, of which there are many, like Laura Mulvey is an obvious example. Also, I think really mirrored like what was going on in like visual arts, definitely for sure, like with kind of the emergence of sort of the kind of a split between like essentialist and kind of psychoanalytic or structuralist feminism in the 70s and 80s. So kind of what are the terms of representation of women, and then like all these discussions about gender and performativity that you were alluding to. So I think it was definitely like a part of a wider landscape, both politically and historically.
Maybe could I just kind of join into that, because I'm thinking back in our first roundtable and the speakers that we had. One of the things that I was really aware of was that each of the collectives seemed to have a particular mode of practice, and I could like look at that in relation to the political imperative in the project. So, for example, Johanna Linsley with I'm With You, working with queer domesticities, and they have practices of eating. And Susan Kelly working with precarious workers and the practice of the tribunal, and the Women of Color Index Read group with the reading group. So I was really interested then in the relation between the practice and the politics. And it strikes me that all of the collectives that we're referring to or talking about here work with image in some way, moving image, photographic image. And I'm just wondering, kind of feeding back into this question, maybe a bit about the theory and the practice, but there seems to be something at stake in the thinking about representation in some of these things that then is mobilized through some of the practices or tested through some of the kind of aesthetics. And I'm thinking of the essay that you sent us around, I saw your notes there, where
really good.
it was great actually, looking at the kind of materiality of the film and these different kind of feminist practices, haptic visualities. So kind of a theoretical kind of understanding of the aesthetics that links it into this kind of political imperative, which then links it into the political milieu that these kind of collectives are kind of organizing within. So maybe, I don't know if anybody wants to talk a little bit about their practice or their aesthetics or the stuff that you guys are working with. Ash, I'm thinking you particularly because you're activating archive through your practice.
Yeah, I mean, oh god, that's it. This question kind of comes up quite a lot with us as working group members in terms of like trying to talk about representation is quite difficult in terms of like Cine Nova, because in a way we're kind of like these bizarre, I don't know if you'd agree with me, Marina, but like gatekeepers to this sort of collection that isn't really like our, like it never was ours, you know, we didn't bring it together. So Cine Nova in itself, or like the working group in itself, is kind of like this sort of bizarre, I guess, like distance practice or something. Yeah. So it's kind of, yeah, I don't know how to like really think about it. Yeah, I guess the way that, like you say, like we do end up trying to kind of do that is kind of thinking about our experiences that extend beyond that kind of collection, because in a way we can't take any sort of authorship over it. So like, yeah, trying to bring other conversations into it all the time, that's like our way of doing it, like a different, and I guess, I don't know, it's not in a way that kind of moves away from like representation, because we can't represent anything. I don't know.
On a kind of separate angle, and one of the sort of thinking about the materiality was one of the things that I sort of realised at some point, partly thanks to my supervisor, talking about the kind of the theory and the practice and the differences in approaches in terms of this images of women approach and the other kinds of approaches, was that unless you have the means to actually sort of stop a film reel, which people basically mostly didn't have in 1972, it's very hard to do a semiotic analysis of a film, because you go to the cinema, and especially when it came to watching women's films, that was very, very hard, and the only space in which that could happen were festivals mostly, or kind of groups that would get together and show things, student clubs and stuff. So the analysis that's happening in those early issues and in that early period is just people going to a film and trying to remember what happened and talking about the images that have lingered in their minds. Whereas people like the Camera Obscura group, they have a steam back which allows them to basically pause the film and look at the stills, and that was a kind of material thing that I just hadn't really thought of until I was really looking at it and thinking about the conditions of how these approaches came about, made such a difference.
That's so fascinating. I think across all three, this discursive potential in the collective work you're doing seems so vital. I'm going to come back to the word therapy because of what your conversations or collective looking back moments are in relation to what you might do in the now or in the future. So the abolitionist future work with prisons, or even the conversations that you were having with the playground design work. I mean, without that level of deep conversation, what would we, with that ability to pause and reflect, which you're doing with the archives and collections. I'm very interested in that, so maybe we have a quick thought on that with therapy in mind, or the therapeutic in mind, and then we'll open it up to the audience because we're a bit short on time.
It's kind of, I think that kind of idea of pausing is really interesting, because I think this is something that kind of comes up in a lot of different struggles in terms of you're constantly firefighting, so you don't have time to pause and think about that, and maybe that's kind of, the work that we are trying to do especially through getting involved with people like women in prison and things, is trying to very specifically look at, I guess, situations that have already happened and what can be learned from looking specifically at the kind of, I guess, models of working and practices that people were doing at that point, because I think that a lot of the time these kind of stories, these narrations do get lost, even though they are these documents and they do exist, they're not kind of widely known, and it's not like a lot of people really actually have a lot of time to go back and try and research and find these kind of different narrations. So in a way, it's kind of, I guess, I wouldn't call that therapy, but it's almost activation or continuation or extending a kind of already existing narrations.
I don't really know if I can address, but it does strike me that there has been a lot of really interesting work, and a lot of it has got lost. Women's Design Service no longer exists, and funding stopped, but somebody did do a research, presumably a PhD on it, which was good, but actually those publications still need to be being referred to and used, and I think we do run the risk of reinventing a lot of things. I love the fact that people are interested in this now, but I hope they do have the time to see what's been done already and grow from that, rather than always having to reinvent the wheel, I suppose. And yes, it's going to look different because it was made in a different time. And you're going to have that problem with Cine Nova stuff as well. I know when I've seen some, it has been discussed amongst groups about, it's what incredibly posh voices they will have, and why are there so many white women talking down to, oh, that's daft. And yet, there's still some really good information in there. And it's also good if we can critique the work that was done before and see where the gaps were and see where we weren't taking enough interest. But, basically with Women's Design Service, it was consult the user, and it's still an issue. The world is still designed for normal man. I mean, it really is. It gets really hard to use the telephone as you get older, for example. The screen's too small. I mean, here we go.
I just want to
sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm just wanting to pop in a little bit with the therapeutic aspect, and also maybe relating it back to this theory and practice a bit, because when we were having that part of the conversation, I was thinking about this idea of thinking and acting. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and the need to be doing both, and maybe the need to withdraw in order to do one, and then to be public in order to do another. But I'm also interested in moments where we're doing this together. So thinking, talking, kind of moving through ideas and questions collectively, I suppose. And one of the things that I was struck by is this idea of the pause, and that there might be something about that moment of pausing, of a kind of collective thinking, that then contributes to some of the acting. So when you do pause to critique or analyze or get angry or whatever, and then you do that in this kind of collective setting, I wonder if I wonder if that relates to the working group, how you guys operate. How do you operate? Do you operate together? Do you talk in group?
Well, we have meetings, but also a lot of the work that we do on a daily basis, some of it is located and some of it is dispersed because we can't all be in the office. So there's a sense in which that collectivity is, in some sense, becomes an administrative routine as well. But also we've introduced ways of making sure we're kind of more aware of the sort of fragility of that collectivity. So also through formalizing it really. So like making sure we take collective decisions and not just kind of assume that decisions are okay if nobody responds to a mail, for example. Just kind of trying to be more reflexive about how we work as a collective and not just sort of collectively work as premise, I guess. So in a way kind of making that part of the material that we're working on, I guess. But that is always, I guess, a process. Also in what is maybe not as clear as in 2010 when the reproductive labor exhibition happened. Part of like working towards that exhibition was the constitution of the Cine Nova working group, because before it was just kind of the volunteers sort of pitching in as and when, running the organization. There was mainly one artist and writer who was doing everything, who was volunteer, and Hedge. Emma was moving to New York, and we had this exhibition coming up, so a collective kind of formed also in relation to those exigencies of making that happen and perpetuating the collective as a living thing in her absence. So it's also kind of, in a way, the collection is a kind of becomes activated in a more collective way. So it was a formal organization, then it was kind of one person, and then it became a sort of working group. So it's gone through a number of different stages.
Should we open it up? Does anybody have any thoughts? And good.
I opened up a similar question on the first collectives, and it's something around thinking intersectionally and thinking about economy and thinking about us as an audience, that educationally we're paying a lot of money to be here, but also that only gives access to certain types of people to this university. So there's been a kind of a sharp increase in fees in the past decade, and with that kind of a rise in rents as well, but with that a decline for spaces for collectivity, for squatting, for housing, for all of these things. So I'm thinking in terms of the idea of urgency, and we are receiving this information, but perhaps we are a group of people that the urgency is different to, let's say, 10 years ago. The class issue present in the educational model is, for me, a very important issue. So I wanted to kind of bounce that back to you and ask, what do you feel this kind of rise in fees is creating to collectivities? We are perhaps a clientele that has less urgency than past, let's say, the population of the past that had access to university 10 years ago. And for me, it's an important question to kind of that I have and that I'm contemplating at the moment.
I really don't know how to answer that, because you are foregrounding a real crisis, and obviously it's a neoliberal construct. They want to stop annoying people like us lot doing stuff, annoying people like you lot taking it on and doing stuff. It's a brilliant way of stopping it, isn't it? I mean, Thatcher's push to home ownership was always about, getting people tied to a mortgage so they keep doing shit jobs and not take more risks. I don't know. I think it is a situation that's designed to make risk-taking difficult. But if you don't earn enough money, you don't pay back your loan, they tell me. And if I'd taken a loan, I would never have been able to pay it back. That's only consolation. I think it's down to you to take the risks. And I think you're in a shit situation. I really, really do. But you can still take risks if you choose to. I wouldn't want to be in your situation. Being a working class girl, I don't like having any debts. I was brought up not to have debt. I think it's impossible that you're being asked to take on huge debt. But what it actually means is reframe it and decide never to pay it back.
Can the audience speak to this a bit?
Yeah, it's down to you, really.
Because can you, the question is around the urgencies that you're facing particularly?
I think it's perhaps the lack of urgency in the kind of people that have access to university, generally speaking, at the moment. The middle upper class have, let's say, 20 grand to invest in an MFA, whereas a lot of working class people would not have that money at the moment. So for me, the issue has to do with potency and urgency, and perhaps we as a group do not have, and of course I'm generalizing big right now, but there is a kind of, perhaps a lack of urgency, which is, for me, creating a question around collectivity and around it being perhaps like another theoretical ground rather than an actual ground for us, for these, people that can afford 20,000 sort of investment. And I think that for me is the issue, or at the moment. That's the question that I'm opening up.
I agree, but I think the issue is that we're anticipating or will expect a crisis that, Rosy, you called it very aptly, will deepen. So the question of collectives now is, it is a viable thing that we understood from several decades ago, and it still remains something that we can draw upon in our future networks or allyships. So I think that soon, very soon, that urgency or potency that you're speaking about may well have to kick into gear if we're to find a way to mobilise better outside or beyond the individual. So I have a feeling that the reason why this collectives grouping has been sort of put together is that we're starting to do it, yet we still find ourselves atomised or divided. I was appalled to hear that the funding for Cine Nova was cut because, of course, why should I be appalled? I shouldn't be appalled because that's the way of neoliberal funders, but essentially we're going to have to do it possibly without funding and with more voluntary work, which is shit because we're already doing that amount of labour. So I think that somehow, whatever we're saying, if we're in a stupor, we have to kind of wake up and probably mobilise through some form of collective action, whether that be striking or in support of the latest support network for Goldsmiths. You know, that we can do it, but it does sound tragically ideal, but it's not. It's just, it has been done.
I suppose also what we're talking about is the philosophy, and it doesn't have to be full time. I mean, you know, sometimes you have to do work doing something and then work collectively in other parts of your life. I mean, it isn't an all or nothing, and I do accept that people are being forced to do a lot of jobs they might not want to do, but you can still find the time. You could choose to work part-time, earn money part-time, work collectively. I wouldn't want to be in the situation that you're in, I hasten to say. I think it's horrendous. But perhaps that's all the more reason. And the other thing the other thing I wanted to say, just to be really difficult, is that collectives can be very difficult as well. I mean, it's all a bit sweet and lovely at the moment. It's not. But it is about how you discover what you believe and what you think, and you beat your head into new theories, and you have to accept difference in ways that you really don't want to, and it is possibly the only way to really, what's this, intersectionality, whatever, I mean, live it. Don't just tick all the boxes, bloody live it. It's hard, but you grow. You grow a lot more than just, you know, me at home on my computer. Sorry.
I just also think on that sense of like urgency and class in the university structure, yeah, you're totally right. Like, I mean, like, I think there's like a higher rate of like young people just not even thinking about going to university anymore. So like, I can't, like, I'm not even thinking about getting a loan. But I think in the moment when you realise that, there are ways, if you're someone that is in that position that can go to university, there are ways of extending out what you learn in that space to other people. That's the kind of, that, yes, that's the urgency that you have to realise in yourself in terms of like extending out that collectivity, right? So we can all sit here and like theorise about it, you're right, it does become this kind of like, you know, inactive way of talking, but in the moment of realising that there's so many things that if you are lucky enough to have lots of time that other people don't, you can kind of extend, you can use what you learn here. And not in a kind of hierarchical top-down way. I don't mean like, you know, patronising, like I'm the bourgeoisie coming to teach the working class about, you know, their liberation or whatever. But I think, you know, it's just about like, yeah, like observing and recognising those privileges, but like also thinking like how can, yeah, what is collectivity and when we are not equal to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of striking a very sort of pragmatic note, Ash, and I would really want to emphasize that, and I think that's also a good aspect of this conversation so far. So I think also like this idea of not romanticizing collectives, so collectives is also something quite functional, something that gets certain kinds of things done, maybe more sort of efficiently and creatively than, you know, one person running an organization with their free labor. Let's have, you know, 5 people running an organization with their free labor, and distribute that work and contribute their interests and research and capacities, and let them expand outwards from that project. But I think also this idea of repurposing and extending the kind of privileged situations into other spaces and other trajectories which traverse that privileged situation but also exceed it and are not necessarily always convergent with it, can be contradictory with it. And also maybe just not to necessarily conflate working collectively with political organizing. They're different things.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that I cannot answer your question, and I'm not really in a very good position to kind of make comparisons between sort of then and now, particularly because my research has all been based in the US, and actually at that point, you know, going to university was in the way it is now a huge privilege. It was incredibly expensive, and I mean, the impression I get from speaking to so many people who are involved in the magazine and from that generation, they were so incredibly mobilised by other conflicts and other movements that were happening around them. And one of the things that so many of them speak about is, you know, that television was this incredible kind of mobilising force because people were able to see and connect with student uprising in France and all this kind of thing. But actually a lot of them kind of dropped out of the academy or the academic system, and Sandra eventually didn't go to university. I think she maybe went to some of the free universities, but went completely down a different route and did not stay within film. And the same for Suwa. And actually, when I finally got in contact with them, I finally tracked them down, they both were kind of like, oh, that thing I did in my 20s. Oh, people knew about that. Like, they just have no idea. Whereas a lot of the camera obscura women were very aware of the sort of their position in that history. And they obviously have stayed within that field. And this is a slightly depressing story, but one of the women who wrote for the magazine, Sharon Smith, wrote a book called Women Who Make Movies. And she just tried to track down every single woman who made films in the early 70s. I went to go meet her, and she lives on this farmhouse in Maine. And she was there because she'd done all this research into women filmmakers and saw that, and she was enrolled to do that herself. She's learning to be a woman filmmaker. And she kept on being told that she was probably going to be the first one ever because there were none in the history of film. Which she obviously discovered was not true, but she realised, she thought, it's going to be really hard. It sounds awful. I'm not going to do it. And she dropped out and she did the back to the land thing, and that's what she did. So yeah, there was a lot of rejection of the academy as well in that period.
Actually, do you mind if I open this back up to the audience? I know we're still in the same question, but I mean, when does are there any urgencies, to use that word, that you're feeling that may warrant this kind of
Alex and there's Bianca and Alex.
I just wanted to ask that, like, in relation to the question, that obviously, like, we can't disagree that class is sort of being entrenched by the neoliberal system and how that's relating to the institutions, but I don't know, I just feel like in relation to what Rosy said as well, that does in some way mean that it's more urgent for us as people who are aware of that and who are dealing with this sort of, with all of the blockages that neoliberalism puts up in front of us in relation to debt and everything. So it feels more urgent.
We do Bianca.
Yeah, and I think that, like, besides that, like, how you were showing images of, like, women, like, tearing up images of themselves in media, like, that's still problems that we have, like despite money. Like there's so many problems out there that exist. And we all, like, I think a lot of our practices, like, have to do with a really specific kind of world of problems that we're tackling. Like, I mean, like, there are some money issues here. We probably don't have the same amount of money issues that, the general public has, but, like, there are still so many issues that we should care about. And, like, female representation is a giant issue for me, despite my money background, you know?
Anyone else? Any thoughts you just want to carry forward or questions? Yeah. Oh, great.
I may be coming at it from a slightly different perspective because I'm not from a very wealthy background and I'm a single mother who just won university credit in Hastings. So I think that though what has been said is true, there is a privilege that comes from knowing that you can take the risk still and it's possible, and that if you're just going to be in debt anyway, there's a freedom with that. A kind of knowing that you won't necessarily be successful or that it won't go your way, you can do that anyway, and there is a kind of comfort in having the freedom to just do what you want because you won't, there's no, I don't really know where I'm going with it, but just that there is always a way to take those risks, and there is always a freedom in not having the responsibility that you could even move forward in a kind of way that people could have done in the 80s or 90s, I guess. I don't know, that's my perspective.
Can I just add that maybe there's also something about this idea of the risk as not being individuated so much? That being kind of part of this neoliberal project, that it's your risk and you take it. And there's something about the potential of collective action that is a little bit of support in that risk, that you might, even just for a moment, you might work with that group, and that's a bit less risky for you personally, but it's maybe risky in terms of where you'll take your thinking or your practice.
Depends what we mean by risk, doesn't it? I mean, risk has been monetized. Everything's been fucking monetized. Sorry, I do speak badly. Sorry about this. Everything's been monetized. It drives me up the wall. It makes me very, very angry. It's as if we'd monetized risk here in our debate. And that's really not what I was talking about. I was thinking about taking the risk that we say what's supposed to do. I mean, making photographs of me and my collaborator as a 70, I'm 72 in a vest. I mean, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to take the risk to put yourself out there like that. Joe's cross on the breast, that was a risk. Risks. Going beyond what you're expected to do. Not being too polite. Not being polite at all. Actually. So honour the woman out there from Hastings, good girl. Yeah, keep going. Because what else is there? And okay, maybe you could look at me and say, oh yeah, bloody baby boomer, we had it so easy. Well, actually, when I went to university, only 5% of the population went. I got there because I worked hard when I was bright. But not everybody went. So there's this kind of sugary notion that all my generation had it so easy. A lot of them didn't. They were doing shit jobs at 15. That's when you left school. So it's about what responsibility you want to take for your own life in the end. And yes, situation's tough, and they're probably going to get worse. So yes, we really do have to work collectively, if nothing else, to sit in a room and bemoan our lives. And that's what, come on, feminism started, life's shit. Let's all sit in a room in a nice group, talk about what shit life is, and then, if we get some energy to change it. That's what it was in the 1970s. So now you've got to start all over again. Sorry. Sorry.
No, that's just perfect. I mean, it brings us back to perhaps the feeling of bizarre elation that we had when we were striking last year, and how terribly flat we felt after we were all told to go back to work. We found a community temporarily that was then immediately absorbed back into the megastructure. And that was bizarre, because all of a sudden we stopped speaking to one another again. So we didn't learn anything in that respect, and that's appalling. But you're right that through a bit of whinging we can do wonderful things. Well, I'm really aware that we are running over time, so maybe we could just... Should we ask any more questions, or we'll stop here and just thank Marina, Clarissa, Rosy and Ash for everything.